So we're picking up in chapter 2 of Pirkei Avos, and we are on the 12th Mishnah, Mishna Yud Beis, Mishnah 12, and we are discussing the teachings of the 5 students of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, and we are up to number 3, which is Rabbi Yossi. So the Mishnah says, Rabbi Yossi says, Yehi mamon chavercha chaviv alecha kishalach. The money or the property of your friend should be as dear to you as your own. That's his advice, number 1. Now, each of these students and sages were each giving basically like 3 pieces of advice. So his number 1 is your friend's property should be as dear to you as your own. Number 2, v'haskein atzmecha lilmod Torah. You should, here they translate, make yourself fit, but maybe like set yourself up, establish yourself to be able to study Torah. She'ena yerushalach, for it's not yours by inheritance. It doesn't come automatically. Even if you come from a family of Torah scholars, that doesn't make you a Torah scholar. A person has to set themselves to study if they want to learn. That's number 2. And number 3, v'chol ma'asecha yiyu l'shem shamayim. All of your actions should be for the sake of heaven. So seemingly 3 mostly unrelated things, it seems. Number 1, your friend's property should be as dear to you as your own. Number 2, set yourself up to study Torah because it doesn't come by inheritance. And number 3, all of your deeds should be for the sake of heaven. So the Midrash Shmuel quotes from Rabbi Moshe Al-Shakar, who suggests that these 3 pieces of advice are actually in response to the 3 things mentioned in the previous Mishnah. The previous Mishnah was the teaching of Rabbi Yoshua, and Rabbi Yoshua mentioned sort of 3 detriments that a person has to avoid. Number 1, he said, ayin hara, a bad eye. Number 2, he said, sinat habriot, despising people, hatred for people. And number 3, he said, sorry, that was number 3 actually. This number 2 was yetzer hara, the evil inclination. So he mentioned 3 things: a bad eye, the evil inclination, and hatred for others. So, and he said all of those things sort of remove a person from the world. We discussed what that means. If that means literally they bring a person, they shorten a person's life, or they just mean a person isn't part of society. So Rabbi Yossi says, here's the way to respond to each of those problems. So number 1 was a bad eye. Again, many different ways to understand the words a bad eye. But one way is that it means that a person looks at other people's things and is jealous, looks at it badly, casts an evil eye on it, the concept of the ayin hara. And to that, Rabbi Yossi says, we have to flip our perspective. We have to look at other people's property, and it should be as dear to us as our own. We should be happy for them. We should care for it like it's our own. That is the response to the person who has the bad eye. We tell him you have to look at things differently. You have to have it that the property of others is as dear to you as your own. To the one who has the challenge of the yetzer hara, the evil inclination, so we tell him or her, haskein atzmecha lilmod Torah. Prepare yourself, set yourselves up to study Torah, because the Talmud teaches us that if a person is challenged by their inclinations, go study Torah, and that helps one overcome their inclinations. And the third idea was if a person finds that they despise people, that they have hatred for others, so to that he says, all of your deeds should be for the sake of heaven. Now, how does that connect? Why is that the response to someone who has hatred for others? He says, because if all our deeds are for the sake of heaven, so we look in the Torah and we see the Torah tells us, do not take revenge, do not bear a grudge. These are commandments of the Torah. Do not bear a grudge, do not take revenge. And so, and it also says, don't hate your friend in your heart. So all of these things, if we can set ourselves up, I really don't like that person, but I'm a dedicated servant of God. And it says in God's holy Torah, don't bear a grudge, don't take revenge, don't hate people in your heart. And so I'm going to try to, for the sake of heaven, overcome that feeling of hatred. So that's the response. The response is, if everything that we do is for the sake of heaven, so then we can use that as a way to overcome if a person has hatred for others, that could be the antidote for that. So again, one way to understand this is addressing the three things from the previous Mishnah, the teachings of Rabbi Yoshua. Rabbi Yoshua said a person has to avoid having a bad eye. To that, Rabbi Yossi now says the property of others should be as dear to you as your own. In terms of dealing with the evil inclination, Rabbi Yossi says, go study Torah. That will help you fight the evil inclination. And in terms of carrying hatred for others, to that he says, do everything for the sake of heaven. You'll be able to overcome that hatred simply because you know that God commands you to not bear a grudge and not despise others, and that can help a person overcome that. That is one way to understand this Mishnah. Now, in general, this concept of kol ma'asecha yiyu l'shem shamayim, all of your actions, all of your deeds should be for the sake of heaven. Now, if a person lives with that motto, then it can be life-changing because it can add meaning to everything that we do in our lives, and literally everything. So the Midrash Shmuel kind of goes through a person's day somewhat, and he says literally what it means is that everything that we can do can be for the purpose of being a better servant of God. So a person eats, a person drinks, a person sleeps. All of these things, they may just appear that we're, as self-care, just taking care of ourselves, but really they are obviously necessary to live, to be functional, to function, and therefore, if our purpose of functioning is in order to be better servants of God, so then we can do those things l'shem shamayim, for the sake of heaven. So he actually says that there's three encounters, types of scenarios that a person might come across, and all of them should be dedicated to l'shem shamayim. One is when we do a mitzvah, when we fulfill a commandment, we should be doing it for the sake of heaven. The other is every so often a person is forced to sin. And even then, if they're forced into that situation, it should be for the sake of heaven. Now that's, gets into a very complicated, topic, but he recalls certain events like Elijah the prophet, Eliyahu Hanavi. He built an altar in a forbidden way because he had to combat the idolaters. There are times where a person has to go against the Torah. We call it like hara'at sha'ah, like it's for a very specific time. It's not necessarily for me and you to determine, but there are times where a person occasionally is required actually to transgress the commandments of the Torah. But even then, it has to be for the sake of heaven. And then, so we have that when we fulfill the mitzvot, the commandments for the sake of heaven, even if a person is forced to transgress the commandment, that should be for the sake of heaven. And finally, just in what he calls derech eretz, just the way of the land, the way, our normal, I'm not fulfilling a commandment, I'm just living a life, again, like we said, eating, drinking. So those things also. So a person eats, a person drinks, a person sleeps to take care of themselves. Why? So they could be a better servant of God. A person goes to work and earns a livelihood. Why? Because they need a livelihood to support themselves, again, to be a servant of God, to fulfill the commandments of charity, of taking care of others, of taking care of one's family. But there's meaning to it if we're not just doing it because we want to go on vacation. If we're doing it because we want to be able to serve God and serve others, so then that that adds meaning. The way that when we speak to people, even if we're just small talk, but if it's to connect with someone and bring them closer to God, so then that's l'shem shamayim. That's for the sake of heaven. Sometimes he says a person needs a break from all these things, from Torah study, from prayer. Everybody needs a little bit of leisure. You go for a hike, you go for a walk, whatever your favorite hobby is, right? But if that's, again, to be able to clear your mind and be able to be a better servant of God in the times where we are directly fulfilling God's commandments, so then there's meaning to that. That's l'shem shamayim. That's for the sake of heaven. And really, probably many, many other examples, but that's what he's calling derech eretz. It's just the way of the land. We're just doing our thing, sort of, but we can do it in a way that adds great meaning to it. And if a person lives a life that's infused with meaning in that way, then it's just a much more very enriched lifestyle. So that's the last piece of advice Rabbi Yossi says in this Mishnah, is kol ma'asecha yiyu l'shem shamayim. All of your actions should be for the sake of heaven. Now, just going back to where it says a person should prepare themselves to study Torah, should establish themselves, because it's not an inheritance. So the Midrash Shmuel comments that intelligence is something that a person's born with. I mean, a person can sort of sharpen themselves, but to some extent, it's God-given, right? How intelligent a person is going to be. Or, the parents contribute, the nurture and the nature, all of it may contribute, but there's not so much control that an individual has over how intelligent they're going to be. So if a person, has God-given intelligence, they're very smart, they're very intelligent. So it's almost as if they're inheriting Torah. They're inheriting the ability to acquire a lot of Torah knowledge. On the other hand, somebody who is less intelligent, they can't remember anything. They can't figure things out. So to that person, it seems like they're not inheriting Torah, because how are they going to acquire Torah knowledge if they don't have the bandwidth, right? So that's what a person might say. So the Mishnah here actually responds to that. And it says, no, the Torah is not an inheritance. Every person can dedicate themselves to Torah study, to acquiring Torah knowledge. Even if somebody is very smart, they don't inherit the Torah on their own. They have to involve themselves in its study. Even if somebody is not so smart, it doesn't mean that they can't learn Torah. And certainly he says a person shouldn't say, well, it's hard for me, and therefore I'm not going to learn. I forget things, I can't figure it out, therefore I'm not going to learn. Because rather the Mishnah says, no, the Rabbi Yossi teaches, no, everybody should dedicate themselves, and first of all, you'll acquire. It's not an inheritance, the person will be able to learn. But even if they only learn a little bit, upon their level, each person will acquire according to their level. And you know what? God will look at each of those people the same. Whether the person is very intelligent and for X amount of effort, they acquire, a great amount of Torah knowledge. And then you have another person who is less intelligent and in the same amount of effort acquires much less. Doesn't matter. They both are putting in the same effort. And that's what the Mishnah says. All of your deeds should be for the sake of heaven. Because whether a person accomplishes a lot. It's not all in what we accomplish in the end. It's in the effort that goes into it. That's what God looks at. And the person who acquires less but put in the same amount of effort, or accomplishes less but put in the same amount of effort, God will look at that person the same. That's kol ma'asecha yil l'shem shamayim. All of your deeds should be for the sake of heaven, because whether Torah is not an inheritance, everybody can put in what they, their own effort, and what God really is focused on is that effort, and whether what we're doing is for the sake of fulfilling his will. Okay, so that's the teachings of Rabbi Yossi. That's the end of Mishnah 12. Okay, on to Mishnah 13. So chapter 2, Mishnah 13, Yud Gimel. The Mishnah says, Rabbi Shimon Omer. Rabbi Shimon says, Havei zahir b'kriyah shema uvetfila. A person should be careful about reciting the Shema daily and with praying, seemingly the Amidah prayer, the Shmona Esrei. Ukishata mispalel, and when one does pray, al tas tfilascha keva, your prayer shouldn't be set. So we'll have to explore what that means. We do have a set composed prayer that we follow. It doesn't have to be that always, but a person can also freestyle. But we do have set prayers. So, but that's not what it means. It doesn't mean you shouldn't have a set prayer. We'll see what it means when we go through. We'll see a number of possible explanations. So it shouldn't be keva. It shouldn't be set. Ela rachamim. It should be requests for mercy, v'tachanunim, supplications, lifnei hamakom baruch hu, before God. Shene'amar, as the verse says in Yoel in the book of Joel, Ki chanun v'rachum hu, God is gracious and merciful, erech apayim, slow to anger, v'rav chesed, full of kindness, v'nicham al hara'a, and renounces, here they say renouncing punishment. Fine, but that's the verse that it quotes, and then it says, V'al tehi rasha bifnei atzmecha. The third teaching, don't be a rasha, don't be a wicked person. Bifnei atzmecha. Bifnei atzmecha, we're going to offer a number of different explanations. For now, we'll translate it as in your own eyes. Don't be wicked in your own eyes. So 3 teachings of Rabbi Shimon. Number 1, be careful with the recitation of the Shema and prayer. When you pray, don't make it set. Rather, it should be supplications of God, merciful prayer, asking for mercy. And number 3, don't be wicked in your own eyes. Okay, so I want to start our explanation actually going back to something we mentioned a couple weeks ago, which was that when we were first introduced to the students of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, and we were first introduced to Rabbi Shimon, so we learned a couple of things about Rabbi Shimon. The first thing we learned was that the praise that Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai gave to his students, Rabbi Shimon, was that Rabbi Shimon is someone who fears sin. And then when Rabbi Shimon was asked, what's the best path a person should choose? So Rabbi Shimon said it's someone who is roa es hanolad, who could see what's to come, who looks ahead, doesn't just live in the here and now, but thinks of the results of one's actions as well. What will result from my choices? So, and we related those 2 teachings, that somebody who thinks about the results of their actions is someone who will fear sin, because we realize that our actions have consequences. And that's Rabbi Shimon. So we mentioned at the time that actually ties in to this teaching of Rabbi Shimon, because Rabbi Shimon now says, person should be careful about reciting the Shema. Now, one of the things that it says in the Shema, in the second paragraph of the Shema, is that if you listen to God, you'll get, God will give you bounty and etc. If you listen to the mitzvos, the commandments, and if you don't, then God will close up the heavens and it won't rain, etc. Which is really this idea of recognizing that a person's actions have consequences and have results. So this is Rabbi Shimon's, this is his go-to topic, is to realize and to think about the consequences of our actions, both in a positive and a negative way. So that's why he was praised for being someone who feared sin. He was someone who he himself said that the most important trait that a person could have is to be able to see ahead and see the results of one's actions. And now he's saying in there, say the Shema, because in the Shema, there's a reminder of that, the results of the consequences of our actions. Okay, so that's just an opening idea. Now, he says to be careful with the Shema and with the morning prayers, or the prayers really. But the Midrash Shmuel suggests it means in the morning, because in the morning, sometimes it's hard for us to get out of bed to pray. We want to just roll over and go back to sleep and sleep till noon. And if we sleep till noon, we'll have missed the optimal time for prayer, for both the Shema and for the daily morning tefillah. And so therefore he says, have a zahir, be careful with these, to be able to overcome that desire to just sleep in. And then it says, and when we do pray, it shouldn't be keva, it shouldn't be set. So what is a set prayer? So a number of explanations here. The first is that if we look at it like an obligation, something that we just want to get over with, our prayers. So that's don't treat it like it's a set thing and it's just an obligation that I want to get over it. No, prayer is an opportunity. Actually, the language of the Ramban, Nachmanides, I was just teaching this last night, the language that he uses to describe prayer is it's a great kindness that God gives us the ability to speak to him and that he listens and answers our prayers. So tefillah, prayer should be seen as an opportunity, not as a burden, as something that I just want to get over with. Additionally, we can understand the word keva to mean not just how we look at it, but how we say it, how we do it. Do we just kind of read through the words without thinking, or do we actually try and concentrate when we pray? Somebody actually just last night told me a joke about a guy who lives a very fulfilling life. He really was very generous with all of his resources, and he studied Torah and he fulfilled all the commandments. And really, he was expecting just the most royal welcome when he got up to heaven. And he gets up to the heavenly court and he appears before God, and he kind of says, well, God, here I am, look at all all that I've done. I'm sure I'm going to get a nice share, in the world to come. And God responds, So he says, what? I didn't hear you. Says, well, I don't understand. So God says, well, that's how you always spoke to me. So that's how I'm speaking to you. So, so Gina, it was very kind of you to unmute so that I could hear you laugh, because that way I can see some people laughing, but if your video's off, then I don't know that you laughed. So I appreciate it. Really.
I laughed a lot longer than what you heard on the mic.
Okay, it wasn't my joke. Okay, now another way to explain this is that, another way to focus on is it says ukisha'ata mispal, when you pray. In other words, it's saying, sometimes we pray, but like, are we really praying? Because we're just going through the motions sometimes, and we're not really there. Our lips are moving, but we're not necessarily present. So it says, and when you pray, and even or it's in a certain way, it's even if you pray, and even if you're actually present, you have mindfulness while you're praying. So still, it says, don't make your tefillah set. What does it mean not to make it set? So another explanation is, don't just assume that since I prayed well, God has to answer my prayers. I prayed with such great concentration after all. So it must be that God has to answer my prayers. Well, that might depend on a lot of things, obviously, and whether we're worthy and whether it's what's best for us, etc. So it could depend on a lot of things. So don't make your tefillah, your prayer, have a set as if like, okay, it's as good as done. No, we have to approach God with humility, and it has to be with supplication. Rachamim and tachnunim has to be we're supplicating, we're asking for God's mercy, and if God accepts it, so or if God doesn't listen to our prayer, so it means we weren't deserving in this case, or it wasn't the best thing for us. And if God does accept it, then it's a great kindness. And so rather it should be merciful and supplication lifnei hamakom baruch hu, before God. What's that saying? So he says, sometimes we have great supplication before others, meaning when we pray, a person might want to look like they're praying very, very sincerely, so that they look good in the eyes of others. But no, that's obviously not the point. The point is that you should look good in the eyes of God. God knows what's in our hearts. And so when we pray, it should be that we're coming before God in here they say, translate, a plea for compassion before God. It should be before God, a plea for compassion, not just in front of other people would make it look like it's a plea for compassion, but actually it should be a plea for compassion before God. Fine. So that's in terms of the prayer. And then finally, the Mishnah says that Atahi rasha bifnei atzmecha. Don't be wicked bifnei atzmecha. So for now, we're going to translate bifnei atzmecha as in your own eyes. Don't be wicked in your own eyes. Why not? Isn't that great? You say, I'm so bad and I have so much to improve, right? The problem is that doesn't really work. If a person thinks that they're so bad and they're so terrible, so then they actually just end up getting down on themselves, and they and first of all they say, well, I'm so bad anyways. Does it really matter if I do, if I mess up more? That's the first thing, and they give up on improving and on repenting and returning to God. So a person should not look at themselves as wicked. Now, everybody makes mistakes. Everybody slips up here and there. But we should not get down on ourselves. We should regret what we did and try to improve and try to move on. But don't look at ourselves as wicked. So how should we look at ourselves? So there's actually two different comments here that Midrash Shmuel quotes that offer two different ways we should look at ourselves. The Rambam, Maimonides, says, don't look at yourself as wicked, but don't look at yourself as righteous either. That's actually there's a verse, I think, in, I forget where it's Proverbs, or maybe it's in Koheles, Ecclesiastes, where King Solomon says, don't be such a tzaddik, don't be so righteous. It means don't think you're so righteous. And so, because if a person thinks they're so righteous, then they think, okay, I'm there already. I have nothing more to improve on. I don't need to grow more. So how should one look at themselves? The Rambam Maimonides says, as average. Person should look at themselves as average. And I'm not perfect. I'm not wicked either. I'm average. And all it takes, though, is a little bit of improvement to get me over the hump to the good side, right? To above average. So right now I'm average. Let me do a few good deeds. Let me fulfill a few mitzvot, and then I'll be on the above average. Now we have to always think that way. Just a few more good deeds could just make such a difference. And that's how Maimonides says one should look at themselves. He quotes another opinion here that suggests that person should actually look at themselves as righteous. If a person looks at themselves as righteous, so they think of themselves somewhat as pristine, pure. And if I'm pure and I'm pristine, then I want to maintain that level of purity. And that will help me avoid sin and transgression because I'm so pure, I'm so righteous. He mentions that in Psalms and Tehillim, King David is constantly, kind of singing his own praises. Psalms is very big. There's a lot of different perspectives that he shares, but one of the ways he expresses himself is he praises himself for his righteousness. And he says, what's the deal with that, right? Where's the humility? Why is he praising himself as being so perfect and so righteous? But the idea is that it's so that he doesn't sin. And this is expressed in one of the verses in Psalms where he expresses himself this way, and it says, in order that I not sin. And that is because if a person sees themselves as righteous, as pure, as pristine, as someone of significance and substance, then it's beneath me to do something that's improper. A person who has great self-respect for themselves. So yeah, certainly certain behaviors are they're just not fit for a person who's righteous. A person sees themselves as wicked, so I'm wicked anyways, right? Or I'm just, even if a person says, I'm just average, so this is okay for me, but it's really not okay. So it's not fit for anyone to act in that way. But sometimes it depends on how we look at ourselves, if we'll be able to imagine ourselves doing certain activities, certain acts. So the more righteous that we view ourselves, the more protected we are, the more the higher level of purity we'll strive to maintain, and many activities we'll view as off limits. So that's one suggestion. Now the words don't be wicked, bifnei atzmecha. So in that first explanation, bifnei atzmecha means in your own eyes, but bifnei atzmecha can also mean by yourself. So another way to read the Mishnah is don't be wicked by yourself. And that really we could take in different directions. One way that he quotes from Rabbeinu Ephraim, he says that don't be wicked by being by yourself. A person, this is an idea that we've touched on before. A person decides to seclude themselves and separate themselves from society and doesn't live with others with love and care. So to that, the Mishnah says, don't live by yourself. Don't be wicked all by yourself. Meaning to be all by yourself would be to be wicked, to be a rasha, because you're living just for yourself and you're not helping others. Along the same lines, or with that, using that same translation, don't be wicked by yourself could mean a person is alone. They say, when I'm alone, when nobody's looking, I'll behave in a way that's inappropriate. So the Mishnah says that even when a person is alone, don't be, and nobody's watching, they'll say, who's going to see me? So the Mishnah says, right, it could be somebody's alone, it could be somebody is alone from anybody that they know. They're in a place where nobody knows them. So these are scenarios where a person says, nobody's going to know what I did. And to that, the Mishnah warns, no, be careful. Don't be a rasha. Bifnei atzmecha. Don't be wicked when you are alone. Along those same lines, he brings a very interesting idea from the commentary, the Pirkei Avos, who says that when a person is alone, they might be tempted to sin. And the Mishnah saying, don't be a rasha, don't be wicked, bifnei atzmecha, in front of your, the word atzmecha comes from the word etzem. Etzem, coming a bone, but it also means one's essence. So don't be wicked before your own essence. So a person's alone, they're saying nobody's watching, but you know what? We're all made up of different parts. We're made up of the physical and the spiritual. Each of us has a spiritual soul that God instills within us. And whenever a person chooses the wrong decision in life, they're really allowing their instincts and their physical to overcome their spiritual, to overcome that neshama, that soul. And so the Mishnah says, don't be a rasha in front of your essence. Remember your soul. Remember there's someone watching, and that soul is kind of suffering and screaming when we make the wrong choices. And so a person who's all alone is not really all alone, because even within an individual, there's different aspects to us, and there's an aspect which is the spiritual, which we can never taint that neshama. If a person is so sinful that so then the neshama just leaves them. So that pure neshama is always present. So don't be a rasha in front of your essence. That's how another way that he says you can read it. And we'll give one more, which is that a person might be tempted to say, listen, everybody else does the right thing. I don't. But what difference does that make? After all, the world is full of good people. God will judge the world as a whole. And my actions won't make a difference because everybody else will kind of carry the burden for me. So to that, the Mishnah says, don't be a rasha, don't be wicked by yourself and claim, I'm fine because everybody else is doing the right thing. Because first of all, everybody's actions affect everybody else. Everybody is responsible for everybody else. And the truth is that when one person does wrong, it does affect everybody else because everybody is responsible for each other. And so it kind of cuts both ways. When a person is sinning, so others are responsible to help that person, to help them improve. On the other hand, that person who sins is not only affecting him or herself, he's also affecting those others. So the Mishnah is telling us, don't be wicked by yourself, because really, everybody, you're not by yourself. You think it's only affecting you, but the truth is that it affects everybody. So let's just go back and just review those different explanations for these words. Don't be a rasha, don't be wicked, bifnei atzmecha. So the first way we translated that was in your own eyes. Don't be wicked in your own eyes, because a person who's wicked in their own eyes gives up hope of improving, thinks that once I'm bad anyways, I could do whatever I want. So no, we should view ourselves either according to Maimonides as a Benoni, somebody who's average, and the next thing I do can make all the difference, or according to others, persons should view themselves as righteous. Someone who's righteous, sin is beneath them. They don't want to taint themselves with any sin, as opposed to someone who already feels tainted. So then what's another misstep? Won't make a difference. So we should view ourselves either as Benoni, as average, or as righteous. The other way to explain it is, don't be wicked by yourself. Bifnei atzmecha can mean by yourself. And that can mean either that a person keeps to themselves and doesn't help others, doesn't reach out to others, lives just by themselves, completely isolated and secluded from others. Or it could mean don't sing while you're alone. No, but you say nobody's watching. And along those same lines, don't sin, don't be a rasha, don't be wicked in front of your essence, because there's always, your soul is always present. And the last one we offered was that don't be wicked by yourself, saying, it's just me, doesn't make a difference. I'll do my thing and everybody else can do their thing, because when I do my thing, it impacts everybody else. We're all responsible for each other. Each individual's actions affect all the entire Jewish nation and the entire world, really. And so we can't just be in our own world and say what I do for myself doesn't affect others, because all of our choices and all of our actions do affect others. Okay, so that's those are the teachings of Rabbi Shimon. So be careful with prayer, with saying the Shema and prayer. When one prays, it shouldn't be set. It shouldn't be automatic. It shouldn't be by rote. It shouldn't be that we assume that the prayers are going to be answered. It should be with humility. And finally, this other idea that one should not be wicked either in their own eyes or when they are alone. Okay. The next Mishnah, and our last one for the day, number 14, is the last student of Rabbi Yochanan Zakkai. The last of 5 was, or at least the last student that became a great sage that was mentioned. So is Rabbi Elazar, the son of Arach. So the Mishnah says, what were his 3 go-to teachings? Rabbi Elazar says, have a shakud lilmod Torah. Be diligent in the study of Torah. Vida mashet tashiv la'apikaros. And the person should know how to respond to an apikaros. An apikaros is like a heretic, someone who denies the basic principles of faith. And you should know before whom you toil. And and the person should know that our employer is faithful and reliable to pay the reward for your work. So that's obviously a metaphor for God, that person should know that that God is faithful to reward and pay each individual for what they earn in this world. So there's kind of 4 things here. There's supposed to be 3, so you have to just decide which ones we're gonna make become 1. But so you could join the first 2 together. You can say, be diligent in Torah study, and then you'll know how to respond to a heretic. Know before whom you toil, and that employer, the one we toil before, is faithful to reward us. Those other second 2 can also go together. Know before whom you toil, and that he's faithful to reward you. Those could go together. So a person can decide how they want to make that into 3. There's different approaches. Okay, so one way to understand this Mishnah is kind of how a person should dedicate themselves. The first thing is be diligent in Torah study. That's the basis for all. That's the basis for knowing what to do. That's our map for life, is the Torah. So that's the starting point. And that's simple, not simple, I guess, but that's basic practice, basic observance, basic ethical behavior, all would fall under be diligent in the study of Torah. Now, if a person has some extra time on their hands, beyond that, they're very quick, they grasp a lot quickly, they're ahead of the class. So then they can devote themselves maybe to some things that are more technical and complicated, less practical, which is kind of polemics, or sort of the way to respond to the heretic. So more, I guess, deeper theological ideas, which a person could live with. It's good to know these things, but a person can still function as a good Jew with the basic knowledge of theology and philosophy. But if a person is able to, and they can go a little bit deeper, so that would be the next step, is to master those topics so that they can know how to respond to the apikoros, to the heretic, and if a person is on the other side of things and they aren't as quick on the pickup and they're not learning as fast as others, so the Mishnah says that's okay too. It's okay. So kind of like what we said earlier in the earlier Mishnah, that remember who we're toiling before. So if we are working on ourselves, we're studying Torah, we're trying to do our best, we're toiling with life, we're trying. So remember who we're working for, right? And God sees all that we do. He sees our effort. He sees that our heart is into it, and he's faithful to reward us for that. So even if a person is not the quickest genius and doesn't pick everything up as fast as others, but that's okay, because remember who we're working for. God sees our effort, and that's why it says, remember who you're toiling before, because that's what God looks at is our effort, and he's faithful. The employer is faithful to pay the reward for our actions, not necessarily for the results. Results are great, but God looks at our effort and our actions. So that's one approach to this Mishnah. Another way to read it is actually what I said at the beginning, which is that you can put the first two clauses together. Not that it's two steps. The way we just said it now is it's two steps. There's study the basics of Torah, gather Torah knowledge, and if you have extra time, then you can learn deeper philosophy to know how to respond to the heretics. Another way to read it is these two things come together. A person should be diligent in Torah study, and then they'll know, as a result, how to respond to the heretics. And by the way, a person may dedicate themselves, I want to be on the forefront of on the front lines, defending our faith against those who attack it. And so I'm going to invest and study. And then they may never find themselves needing, and that would be great, needing to defend our faith against anyone. So it may seem like it was all for naught. I invested all this effort to know how to respond to the heretic, and no heretics, they were too scared of me, right? They never came my way. So was it a waste of time? So to that, the Mishnah says, don't worry, it's not a waste of time. Know before whom you toil and who your employer is. God wants, again, like we said, God wants to see our effort, and God will reward us for our efforts, even if it never actually is needed. Like in this example, where the person studies to defend the Torah and defend the Jewish faith against heretics, and never meets a heretic. But God sees that effort, and that has value in itself. Now, it does say that you should know how to answer a heretic. It doesn't say you should know how to debate a heretic. You should know how to attack the heretics. It says you should know how to answer a heretic, meaning the Mishnah is not suggesting that we go and seek them out and try to debate them. Rather, if they come to us and they question us, or even, doesn't have to be us personally, but someone that we know. People have told me before, actually, that their coworkers, they tried to missionize them, towards Christianity, And so, yeah, such a person has to know, either should just avoid the conversations, but alternatively should study up and learn how to respond to those types of conversations. That doesn't mean that they should try to engage them in those conversations, but they should know how to respond. So that's what the Mishnah says: know how to respond, know how to answer, but don't try to engage people in these types of questions. And lastly, he points out, he quotes from a Rabbi Al-Mushnino, who says that also the way that it says it is, doesn't say no to answer. It says know what to answer. And he feels that there's something in that word, knowing what to answer. But in other words, he says, we have to know what we are answering. We can't just kind of read it from a book, right? And say, but it says over here, right? If we don't understand it ourselves, then we're not going to be able to properly represent a position, so what it's telling us here is, when it says know what to answer, it means not just know the words to answer, but to know it, to understand it, to take the time to properly understand our positions. And I guess what it comes down to is kind of understanding our basic beliefs and theology. And a lot of it can be found in the writings of Maimonides, of the Rambam. Of course, it takes much effort to really properly understand all of our philosophical and theological positions. And I mean, nobody's going to understand everything, but part of what it's saying is, if somebody were to engage us in one of these types of conversations where they're attacking our beliefs and our faith, and if we don't know how to answer at all, so then that's definitely a problem. But even if we can sort of say the words, but we don't understand what we're saying, that's also not good, because they'll be able to continue their attack and maybe sway us. So the Mishnah is telling us that we should be diligent in our study and thereby know how to respond to the heretic, to the apikoros, and not just know the words, but to know what it is that we're saying and to properly understand it. And then when we answer them, so then our words will actually be, if not received by the other person, but at least for ourselves, it will make sense what we're saying to ourselves. And that's probably the most important thing if we ever become engaged in such a conversation. Now, the best thing, I think, is to just try to avoid those types of people who are attacking us. But sometimes we do have to address questions, and it's important for us to know how to address them for ourselves as well. Okay, we got through in record time here, 3 Mishnahs. So you get out early, makes up for all the times I held you late. See, the last day of school, you always get out early, right?
Yeah, I was just thinking, school's out.
Right.
Thank you, Rabbi.
My pleasure.
Rabbi.
Thank you.
So just in case anyone missed the announcement at the beginning, so we're going to go on a little break here for a month, and we're going to resume on August 31st. And when we resume, we're going to be starting a new topic, which is going to be the book of Jonah, the book of Jonah, Sefer Jonah, and we'll maybe pick up Pirkei Avos another time, but we'll see how all the chips fall.
Rabbi, I have a quick question.
Okay, please.